Hello and welcome to this video for basic sentential logic and formal fallacies and cognitive biases. This video is going to cover material corresponding to section 5.2 of the text. And in particular, we're continuing the ad hominem fallacies. There are four versions of ad hominem. I talked about the first version in the previous video, ad hominem circumstantial. In this video, we'll be talking about the other three versions of that, which are the ad hominem abusive, ad hominem tu quoque, and ad hominem association. So the overall definition of ad hominem, and this covers all four subtypes, is that it's a fallacy that's committed when the arguer ignores the merits of their opponent's argument and instead, in one way or another, makes reference to their opponent themselves, and then claims that they've discredited their argument when they haven't. With ad hominem abusive, this is when the arguer simply verbally abuses their opponent, okay, rather than addressing their argument. So, for example, Principal Smith says, I think your child, so say a meeting with the parents at a school, I think your child should be held back a grade. He's younger than his classmates. Material seems to be a bit too advanced for him. So the principal has produced an argument. The conclusion is hold the child back a grade. There are some reasons for that. The parents then reply to the principal, screw you, you fascist dipshit. And you can see that the parent has not engaged with the principal's argument at all. There's just heaped verbal abuse. They've insulted the principal. So it looks something like this. Smith has some argument. Again, it doesn't matter what the details of this are. The argument is for conclusion R, and there's some premises, whatever. The person replies to Smith by just some kind of insult or some sort of abuse or something like that. Now, as I mentioned before, well, I'll talk about this in a minute. Let's look at another example, because this example is going to bring out this thing that I want to talk about. Pete says, have you read the new book by Amanda Hugginkiss? Rick says, are you kidding? She's dumber than a box of wet hammers. Now, let's assume that Pete maybe is clear from context. This isn't important why we think this, but just to get the example going the way I want to talk about it. Assume that it's clear that Pete's trying to argue that Rick should read this book. Rick's now replying to this in a certain kind of way with an insult. Now, of course, Rick's not insulting Pete in the prototypical ad hominem abusive. You're insulting the person making the argument. But it could also be Pete says, hey, have you read my new book? And Rick could say, are you kidding? You're as dumb as a box of hammers. Okay. Here's the thing I want to get at with this. I'm going to talk about this fallacy, this example in a minute, because I don't think it's really fallacious, even though it fits the pattern of ad hominem abusive. In this case, it's not a fallacy. Once you've determined that there's an argument, what are the premises and conclusion, the reasoning, and you have an idea of what fallacy it could be, you can see, you're looking at the reasoning, and you can see that it fits the pattern of one of the fallacies. You're not done, because you need to ask yourself one final question. Is it really fallacious? It fits the pattern, but is the key consideration that the pattern is alerting you to, is it really fallacious? Here's the way to think of this. Each informal fallacy is a pattern of argument. And what that pattern is telling you is that an argument that fits this pattern can have a certain kind of weakness if you look at this certain location. Arguments that have a certain pattern can also have a certain kind of weakness possibly here. And that's telling you that you should look at that spot to see if that weakness really is there. Okay? And usually these patterns, or the specific spot, is that the informal fallacies are patterns that make an irrelevant claim or an irrelevant consideration seem relevant. So remember the ad hominem circumstantial, where you pointed out that someone had an ulterior motive, therefore you reject their argument. That's a pattern where the person engaging in that fallacious reasoning is trying to make it seem as though the fact that this person has an ulterior motive is relevant to whether their argument was good or bad. But it really isn't relevant. Okay? But because they're patterns that tell you where a problem could be, you still need to check and see if the problem really is there. Okay? And in this case, this is the pattern of reasoning that Rick went through when he was responding to Pete. The author is really dumb, therefore I haven't read the book and I'm not going to read it. This fits the pattern of ad hominem abusive. It's drawing a conclusion on the basis of a sort of insulting, an insult, or something that could be an insult or a negative assessment or something like that. The question is that relevant in this context? And arguably, it is. In this case, whether or not someone, if you think someone is really dumb, that's a relevant consideration as to whether you want to invest time it would take to read their book or something like that, okay? Compare this to, so in this case, the insulting assessment is relevant to the conclusion. So it's not fallacious. Even though it fits the pattern of ad hominem abusive, it's not really committing the fallacy. Let's look back at compare this to the fascist argument here. If we were going to put this in standard form, it would be something like, the principal is a fascist, therefore my child shouldn't be held back a grade. Or maybe it would be something like, principal said my child should be held back a grade. That's premise 1. Premise 2, principal's a fascist. Therefore 3, we can reject the principal's argument. Something like that. Hopefully you can see that in this case, the insulting assessment is not at all relevant to the conclusion. Okay, first off, in this case, calling the principal a fascist probably wasn't meant to be taken literally. The parent wasn't actually trying to claim that the principal was a member of some fascist political party. But even if it was supposed to be taken literally, it's irrelevant. Even if the principal's a fascist, the principal gave an argument. The student's younger than peers, the material seems to be too difficult, therefore hold the student back a grade. That argument's either good or bad, regardless of the political affiliation of the principal. It has nothing to do with it. Okay, there's no sense in which this is relevant to that. Okay, and that's what the pattern of ad hominem abusive is telling you. It's saying there's a pattern of argument where a lot of times people think that something like this is relevant to this. And so once you see that that pattern is being instantiated by an argument, you know where to look. And you just have to ask yourself, well, is the fact that he's a fascist relevant to this? No, therefore it's abusive fallacy. In the case of, is the fact that the author's really dumb relevant to whether you should read their book? Yeah, it is relevant. So even though it fits the pattern of ad hominem abusive, it's not really a fallacy. Okay, so that's why I said, and this is kind of the final point I want to make about argument analysis, is you determine whether there's an argument, the premises, conclusion, the reasoning. At that point, you can see which informal fallacy patterns it might fit. It's a candidate for, or it fits the pattern of a circumstantial, ad hominem circumstantial, or ad hominem abusive, or one of the other ones we'll talk about. But then you still need to go one step more and say, is it really fallacious? And in this case, if you were analyzing this on a quiz, you would analyze it by saying, yeah, this argument fits the pattern of ad hominem abusive, and it really is fallacious because this consideration isn't relevant to the conclusion. Whereas if you were analyzing this one, Pete says, hey, have you read the book by Amanda Hugginkiss? And Rick says, are you kidding? She's dumber than a box of wet hammers. You would say, this argument fits the pattern of ad hominem abusive, but it isn't fallacious because the negative assessment in this case is relevant to the conclusion. Okay, let's move on to the next fallacy, ad hominem tu quoque. That's Latin for you too, or you also. This is where A argues that some activity is wrong, or that B should stop doing something, and B responds by pointing out that A does it also. Okay, so Smith says P and Q therefore don't do X. Or maybe just don't do X, but there's some argument here, and the conclusion is people shouldn't do X, or you shouldn't do X, or whatever. And then Jones just replies, well, you do X, Smith, so it's okay if I do it, or it's okay if everyone does it. And you can see why it's an instance of the ad hominem fallacy. Jones isn't addressing the argument. Jones is just addressing something about Smith, namely the fact that Smith does X, whatever X is. So here's an example. Parents having a talk with their kid. You shouldn't smoke, it's bad for your health. So the parent has an argument. Conclusion, you shouldn't smoke. And the premises, one premise, it's bad for your health. Okay, smoking is bad for your health, therefore you shouldn't smoke. Something like that is the parent's argument. We're not really interested in analyzing the parent's argument. It's the child's response, or the kid's response, that we're interested in. The kid says, you hypocrite, you smoke 3 packs a day. So what's happening here? The dad made an argument. Child shouldn't smoke because smoking is bad for his health, something like that. And the kid is responding to his dad's argument. And we're interested in the response. This is the one we're analyzing, not this one, not the dad's argument, but the child's response. Is there an argument there? So let's just always ask yourself, is there an argument? What's the conclusion? What are the premises? Well, there's 2 possible conclusions. Okay, this is an example that's actually ambiguous. There's 2 ways you could analyze what the kid is trying to say. The most straightforward way, in most contexts, if you were just overhearing this conversation, you would think that the kid's trying to justify their own smoking behavior, or they're countering their parents' claim that they shouldn't be able to smoke. Okay, something like, it's okay if I smoke. Or maybe the conclusion is, my dad's a hypocrite. Because that's actually what the kid said, right? Dad just said, Dad, you're a hypocrite. You smoke 3 packs a day. The kid didn't say, hey, it's okay if I smoke. All right? But remember, sometimes conclusions are implicit. We have to go beyond what's actually said to what the intent behind it was. So one way we could analyze the argument is this way. My dad has argued that I shouldn't smoke, but my dad smokes, therefore it's okay if I smoke. Now, if this is the argument, it's an ad hominem tu quoque, right? It's simply pointing out that the person who made the argument does that thing themselves. Therefore, it's okay if I do it. That's a tu quoque. But what if the conclusion isn't this? What if the conclusion really is, my dad's a hypocrite? Same 2 premises. My dad has argued I shouldn't smoke, but my dad smokes, therefore my dad's a hypocrite. That's a good argument, okay? Because really, I mean, a hypocrite, just by definition, is somebody who tells other people to do things that they themselves don't do, or vice versa, tells other people not to do things that they do. And so you couldn't have a better argument to the effect that someone is a hypocrite, okay? Recall something I said in the first video. What we're given is what is actually said or written, and it's rare that this is really a clear and completely explicit guide to the actual reasoning. And in this case, this is what the kid said. And there's two different things that might be going on here in terms of the reasoning. What is it? Maybe the kid had this in mind. Dad said I shouldn't smoke, but my dad smokes, therefore it's really okay if I smoke. My dad said I shouldn't smoke, it's not okay if I smoke, but really it's okay if I smoke. The kid is justifying his own smoking behavior or thinks he's justifying it. Or maybe the kid's point is not to justify his own behavior, but just pointing out that his dad's a hypocrite. We don't know, just based on this, which it is. It could be either, right? So which is it? Sometimes you can make a good guess from context. You bring in your real world knowledge, common sense. Sometimes, though, the answer is just both. The person making the argument wasn't really clearly distinguishing these two things, kind of confused them somehow. Now, even if that's the case, and in some of the analyses you'll have to do for the quiz and maybe the final, the arguments will be ambiguous in this way. Just because the person that you're analyzing is confused doesn't mean you should be confused. And so if you were given something like this on a quiz, what you should do is say, look, there's two different things that might be going on here. Maybe it's this, the kid is arguing that it's okay if they smoke, in which case this is an ad hominem tu quoque fallacy, because the person is justifying their own behavior just by pointing out that their opponent themselves does that behavior. The other possibility is that the kid is just arguing that their dad's a hypocrite. They're not trying to justify their own smoking behavior. They're just making the point that their dad's a hypocrite, in which case that would be a good argument. And so what you would do is you would just distinguish the two arguments and analyze each one, so that even if the person making the argument isn't clear, you've at least shown that you can think clearly about what's happening. Here's a couple more examples. I'm not going to talk in detail about them, but you'll get the idea. Editors of the Sacramento Bee have accused our company of being one of the worst water polluters, but the Bee is responsible for more pollution than we are. They own Axis Chemicals, from whom they get their ink, and dump tons of chemicals into the river every day. Here's another real-world example. Comedian Carol Burnett filed copyright infringement suit against the makers of Fox TV's cartoon sitcom Family Guy over an episode poking fun at the performer, poking fun at Burnett. The lawsuit claims that Family Guy violated Burnett's rights to her name and likeness by depicting her signature character in a segment, blah, blah, blah. The suit seeks damages, says the cartoon used a slightly altered version of the musical theme, blah, blah, blah. Spokesman for 20th Century Fox, that's the people being sued, said the suit was without merit. References to Burnett amounted to parody, and here's the important part. This is the studio replying to the lawsuit. Family Guy, like The Carol Burnett Show, is famous for its pop culture parodies and satirical jabs at celebrities. We are surprised that Ms. Burnett, who has made a career of spoofing others on television, would go so far as to sue Family Guy for a bit of comedy. So, again, you might say, well, look, the studio is just saying they're surprised. We made a lot of predictions about what Carol Burnett would do, and this one wasn't on our list. That surprised us. But clearly that's not just what's happening here. The studio is trying to justify their own the fact that they used a likeness of this person in their parody. They're trying to justify that against the accusation that it was wrong by pointing out that the person making the accusation, Carol Burnett, did that same thing herself in her show. Okay. Last ad hominem fallacy, ad hominem association. Ad hominem association is committed when the arguer claims that their opponent, or someone involved in the issue, but usually it's the opponent, is associated with some person, group, or event that has some negative connotation. And once that connection or association is made, they argue that that supports their own position, or that we should use that to conclude that their opponent's position is bad. So for instance, Smith is arguing for R and has an argument for it. Again, this doesn't really matter because Jones is going to ignore this anyway. The point is just that Smith is giving us an argument for R. And Jones comes in and says, Smith has argued in favor of R. But Smith is associated with some bad thing, whatever that is. It depends. We'll see examples. So just pointing out that Smith has some negative association. Therefore, we should reject R. So, for instance, Barbara has argued that we should protect the rainforest, since allegedly if we do not, then we will be causing damage to the environment. But my private investigator just told me that Barbara has been secretly donating money to the neo-Nazi groups throughout the region. If that doesn't discredit her position, I don't know what does. So here's the pattern, so to speak, for an ad hominem association argument. X, whoever person is, some person has argued that C, here's their conclusion. So this would be Barbara arguing that we should protect the rainforest. X is associated with some bad thing. So this would be, but Barbara has been given money to the neo-Nazis. Okay, therefore we should reject C. Therefore we should reject her claim that we should protect the rainforest. Screw the rainforest. Okay. And you can see that this fits the pattern of that. So this argument here would be fallacious. It's an example of ad hominem association fallacy. And remember, part of the reason for that is that once you see it fits the pattern, you also have to ask yourself, is it really fallacious? Is the fact that she contributes money to the neo-Nazis relevant to whether we should protect the rainforest? No, it's not. So not only does it fit the pattern of ad hominem association, it actually does commit the fallacy. It's a fallacious argument. Now, in order to see that, compare this to a slightly different version. Here's an argument that also fits the pattern, but it's not fallacious because the association is relevant to the conclusion. Barbara has argued that she would be a good choice for mayor since she is unbiased and would help to fairly ease racial tensions in our city. But you may recall Barbara as the woman who gave money to the neo-Nazi movement in last year's election. And here there's an implicit conclusion, therefore she would not be a good choice for mayor, or therefore we should reject her bid to become mayor. And we can see that it still fits the pattern. Barbara argues that we should elect her as mayor. Barbara contributes money to neo-Nazis. Therefore, we should reject the idea that we should elect her as mayor. Now, it still fits the pattern. Okay. But, so that means that if there is a fallacy here, it could very well be an ad hominem association fallacy. You can tell that, okay, it's just pointing out that this person is associated with a bad group. So maybe it's an ad hominem association fallacy. Is it really fallacious, though? Is this association relevant to the conclusion? In this case, it is. Obviously, someone being sympathetic to neo-Nazis and to the point of contributing money to them is really relevant to whether you should be electing them mayor. So here's the two arguments. This is the mayor, elect me mayor version, and this is the protect the rainforest version. Both of these fit the pattern of ad hominem association. So regardless of which one I give you on a quiz, if I give you one of these, you should be able to look at it and see, oh, it's arguing against Barbara's conclusion by showing that she has this association with a negative thing. So either way, you should be able to tell that it fits the pattern for ad hominem association. That said, this one commits the fallacy, right? Wait, this one does not commit the fallacy. Why? because even though it is just appealing to an association, here it's relevant. Whether she contributes to Nazis is relevant to whether we should elect her mayor. This is a good argument. Okay, so this isn't committing the fallacy. This one, on the other hand, it fits the pattern and it's fallacious. Contributing money to Nazis isn't relevant to whether we should protect the rainforest or not. Okay. So that's it for the ad hominem association fallacies. Keep studying hard, doing exercises, and good luck.